Hello, wonderful people. Um, Welcome again to another session of our Azure administration series. So, this is the fourth day, and what we're going to do is just going to give it a few minutes whilst people join the session. So, like always, I'm your host, and I got the speaker here, Sir David. Hey, David, how you doing?
Yeah, doing good, man. Doing good. Just been a very, very busy day, of course, as always, and everything. Yeah, how about your day? How's your day been? Has it been busy, been crazy,
It
been
has
normal?
been busy. I mean, it's
Wow.
a lovely. It looks like kind of lovely outside, but unfortunately, because of work, we have to stay in. So I didn't really get a chance to enjoy the sun.
Yeah,
Been busy, busy all day.
yeah.
Yeah.
True, true. Yeah. So same. Yeah. So it's also like been really busy, and the weather. Yeah, that does look good outside, but hopefully, at some point. So, one quick one. So, because you promised Sakofi, you promised that you're going to take me to Ghana at some point. So
Definitely.
what are we going to be seeing when I visit Ghana? I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be awesome.
Yeah. After this COVID madness, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of places you can actually visit in Ghana.
Yeah.
I mean,
For
we
you,
got
like which side of Ghana are you from? Which side of Ghana did you grow up?
from Kumasi,
Kumasi.
The Ashanti region,
Wow, I
and
have heard of the
yeah,
Ashanti region before. Yeah,
yeah,
awesome.
it's a lovely place. Um, I mean, for you personally, probably Accra would be the place for you.
You think so? No, I want to.
Yeah,
I want to see like I really want to see like just different sites and just go to different places.
yeah,
There's a lot of amazing things that I've heard, and it's a shame that I've not visited, never visited. I think it'll be awesome to go to visit.
definitely. I mean, there's a lot going on in Ghana at the moment. With the diaspora, people tripping to Ghana. So these have given the opportunity for a lot of local guys to create a lot of businesses that are tourist more like a focus. So
Oh,
in terms of tourist attraction, there are many places, and during the slave trade, there were a lot of castles and forts. So these are the places that a lot of people love to visit. And aside from that, there are other natural resources or natural, forests or wildlife you can also go and see as well.
hmm.
So, I mean, it's a very nice place, and the weather and the food are also great as well.
Awesome,
Yeah,
awesome, and I'm looking forward to also getting to Cesar Coffee's Gold Farm. So
yeah,
that's why I want to go to. Okay, so Sakofi, we can make a start today. So
yeah,
what
sure.
I'll do is I'll go ahead and share my screen. So let's go to share my screen. So just a quick reminder to people that are attending, if you're yet to register for our meetup, what are you waiting for? So this is how you get notified of future events that we have. And what Sakofi and myself are doing in this case is that we have decided to do this every Mondays and Tuesdays. So that helps to add a bit of consistency to it. So every Monday and Tuesday, Sakofi and myself, we're going to be live and we're going to be going through an Azure certification study. So we're starting with the
Right.
Azure Administrator, but we're going to extend to other Azure certifications like the Azure Solutions Architect, Azure Developer, Azure DevOps Engineer, Azure IoT Engineer, and all those other interesting stuff as your AI engineer. So we'll be extending into all of those.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole point of this is to help the community, especially with your exams and also at work. These services seems to be something that is becoming extremely essential if you're in the IT industry. So make sure you join our social media platform, especially YouTube. I mean, if you join on YouTube or Twitch, make sure you also hit the like and also subscribe. So
Yeah,
thank you.
that's very important. Yeah. Okay. So what are we going to be doing today? So here's where we are at the moment. So let me just quickly bring up on my screen. So where we had a moment, because yesterday we talked about governance and compliance. So we talked about this yesterday. And today we're going to carry on with governance and compliance and actually conclude that objective. So, and then from next week, we're going to move to virtual networking and we're going to have some amazing conversations on networking. So, Sakofi, is a networking expert himself. So, I look forward to interesting conversations here. So, with governance and compliance so today we're going to be looking at role-based access control. So, what I'll do is I'll go to bring up the slides and I'll just get to introduce that. So, Sakofi, if you remember on the first day, and actually like yesterday, and actually other days of this particular of this particular live study series, we talked about the difference between Azure AD and Azure resources. Right? We said if anyone wants to use Azure, they need two main things. They need an Azure AD tenant, which is where the identities are stored, and they need an Azure subscription.
That's right.
Yeah.
For the resources.
So, if people want to be able to get access, they need something called role-based access control. That's how we define the access level that people are going to have. So, role-based access control is the authorization system for managing access to Azure resources. That is how we define this is what Kofi can do. This is what David can do. This is what Akwasi can do. So we define all of those using role-based access control.
And is this one defined and attached to the user's, let's say, group? That means the identity, or is it attached to the resources?
Very good point. So it can be either. And we'll get into that when we break it down in granular detail. So we're going to look at that in more details. But one of the first points I want to mention here, Sakofi, is that there is a big difference between Azure AD and Azure resources. You say, yeah, David, you've mentioned that before. Here's what I mean by that. Just because I give Sakofi permission to Azure AD does not mean that you have permission to do anything with Azure resources. So these two are actually separate in some way from each other.
Okay.
Yeah. So if I want to give Sakofi permissions to do and perform operations in Azure AD, I will grant you what is called Azure AD roles. That is how I grant you permission to be able to perform certain operations in Azure AD is by doing Azure AD roles.
Okay. So what sort of permissions can that be granted?
Very good question. So here are some examples. So, for example, there is a built-in role. So, built-in role means roles that were created or pre-created by Microsoft that we just need to assign that to our user. So, they have the permissions already defined. We just assign that to user. For example, there is a role called Global Administrator role in Azure AD. Global Administrator role gives a user permission to do anything and everything with Azure AD. The user can add users, add groups, delete groups, even delete the tenant itself if they want to.
There's no limit. Once you are global admin, that means you have the superpower to do almost everything.
Exactly, Sakofi. That's exactly right. So essentially, you have the superpower to do everything. However, with a global admin privilege, that does not necessarily mean you have any access to do anything over here.
Oh, I see.
Because this one has its own role-based access control authorization system, which is separate from this. So that is called Azure Halfback roles. So the role assignment for this is called Azure AD roles. The role assignment for this is called Azure Halfback roles.
So the Halfback roles is more to do with resources, what you can actually do in terms of resources.
Exactly. So this has to do with identity, right? So the identity store, I'm giving you permission to the identity store. This has to do with the resources. So it's like saying this, Sakofi, because I've made you a domain admin, right, in a domain, does not necessarily mean you have access to an application server.
That's right.
Right. So that's what this is talking about. So let me quickly go to the portal and just show you an example of what this looks like. So what I'll do is if I go to the Azure portal over here, if I go over to the Azure AD tenant and I have some users here, but I'm going to create a new user. So I'm just going to create a new user very quickly. So let's go on the users. So right now I'm in the Azure AD tenant. I'm not in under Azure resources. So I'm just going to go add a new user, and my new user will be called Sir Coffee. So let's go to do that. Sir Coffee, and I'll just make a note of your username. And of course, you always have to put the Sir, otherwise you get into trouble. So, and I'll set a temporary password here. So set a temporary password. So you see here where it says roles, Sir Coffee.
Yeah.
By default, if I just carry on and use the default option, the account that I'm creating for you will only give you just user permission to Azure AD. In other words, it's just a normal user and doesn't really have administrative permissions.
Oh, I see.
However, what I can do is I can click on that and I can go configure another role. Now, if you have a look at this, this says these are directory roles, right? So these are not Azure Halfback roles. These are roles to grant permissions to Azure AD. So if I go over here, Global Administrator, and I'm going to assign that role to Sir Coffee, and usage location is important. Do you want to guess what usage location is used for? Sir Coffee, what do you think? Usage location, what is that used for?
Well, I think I'm not too sure, but I think probably
It's
it
one
might have
that
something to do with the resource, right?
it's one that confused me for like a while and stuff. So what this is used for is for Microsoft licensing.
Oh, I
So
see.
because certain features are not allowed in certain locations in the world.
Yeah.
Right. So I'll give you an example. So for example, if you like in Brunei, for example,
Yeah.
right, you cannot use like the voice call feature. Right, if you were to use the
Yeah.
voice call feature, there are certain features that are not available. So once you set a user's usage location, Microsoft will use that to determine if a feature will be available to the user or not. So if I set the user's location to a location where a particular feature is not available, whenever the user tries to use that, they're going to get a message that says, sorry, this feature is not available for your location. So that's what usage location means, right?
Right.
Yeah. And if you think about it, Sir Coffee has a company. Sir Coffee has, Sir Coffee Gold companies in Ghana, right? They sell pure gold around the world. And you have like an office in the UK, you have an office in US, you have an office in just around the world in Hong Kong and different places around the world. Now, whenever you're creating user account for your different users, you want to specify the right usage location for them for compliance reasons, so that you stay in line with the compliance of the location that the user is using the service from. So that is the importance of that one.
Okay, so is that location a requirement? Can I set this up without the location?
If you do, so you can initially, but then when you want to configure certain things, you're going to get an error message. It's going to say you need to go set a usage location. Because, especially when you want to go assign a license to the user. So if I just create your account without the usage location and I want to go assign a license to you, it's going to say, no, you need to set the usage location before you assign the license.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So I'll leave all others non-selected. No one manages Sir Coffee ever. Sir Coffee is his own. So I'll just go ahead and click create. So what I've done is I've created an account for you, but that account as global administrator role in Azure AD. So if I go back to my directory and I go to under roles and administrators, so this is Azure AD. And if I go to under global administrators, you will see that you are a global administrator in Azure AD. So let's go quickly verify that. So global administrator, let's go bring that up and let's go see who are members. So you can see Sir Coffee's account is there. So what I'll do is I'll go log in with your account, Sir Coffee. So let's go do that. So I'll go over here. I'll put in your username. I'll just make that larger for people to see. And I'll click next. I'll put in your temporary password. And I'll press enter. And it will ask me to change it the first time. So I'll put in the password and I'll put in a new password. And let's put sign into that. So now I'm signed in as Sir Coffee to this environment. But I want to show you something. So now you're a global administrator, right? We saw that just a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Let's see if you have access to do anything on Azure resources as a global administrator. So let's go see, with the global administrator privilege, can Sarkozy do anything with Azure resources? So it signed me in, so that looks good. And it's got all of this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go under subscriptions. And if I click on that, let's see what we're going to see. Nothing, right? So here's a global administrator in Azure AD. They cannot even see the subscription. We know there's a subscription because if I go over here and I go under subscriptions, I can see my subscription right here once it shows up. However, logging in with Sarkozy's account, you don't even see any subscription. So it's the subscription over here, but logging in with your account, you can't see any subscription. Yeah. So the reason for that is what we're explaining here. There is a difference between permissions to Azure AD and permissions to Azure resources. So, yeah. So, for example, if I want to grant you permission to Azure resources, then I need to go grant your account one of these roles on any of the scope. So we'll dive into that today. So I can grant you. So, for example, if you have roles like owner, contributor, reader, those are Azure halfback roles that gives permission to resources.
So these sort of roles, what does it give you? Like the owner, contributor, and the reader, what does it entail?
Very, very good question, Sarkozy. So we're going to delve into this in a few minutes. Okay. We're going to actually go into those roles and see. And we're going to break down some things that can be confusing to people. So we will do that. Yeah. So let me move further here and let's see some other stuff. So component of role-based access control. What makes up role-based access control? Let's delve into that. There are four main things. Number one, we have the security principle. We see what that is in a minute. We have the role definition. We have the scope, and we have the role assignment. So let's take this one by one and let's look at what it means. First of all, with the security principle. Security principle means the identity that we want to assign permissions to. So that's what security principle means. And that identity can be a user, it can be a group in Azure AD, it can be a service principal. By the way, what a service principal means is an identity for an application. So I have an application. An application is not like a user that's logging in interactively, right? That's sitting in front of a computer, right? It's an application just making API calls. So if I want to create an identity for an application, I create a service principal for that application, and then I can put in the service principal credentials in my application, right? Managed identity is an identity for an Azure resource. So this one even takes it further. If my application is running inside an Azure resource, right, and I want my application to be able to use the identity of the resource that it's running on, I can give the resource a managed identity, and then my resource can use the identity of that. My application can use the identity of that resource to access services in Azure. So that's what that's talking about. I think Opayemi has a question or something in the chat window.
Okay, yeah. Let me just go there.
So let's see. So which of the Azure subscription is the best for practice purpose? So just create a free trial subscription. So I use an Azure Pass subscription, which is also a free trial. So just create an Azure free trial subscription, and that's the best to start with. So you get certain free access to certain services for about 12 months, and you also get about $100 or $150 for about a month. So that will be the best to start with. Okay. So service principal, we said that's the identity that I want to assign permissions to. And thanks very much, Mohammed, for the kind words. So really appreciate the kind words. So the security principal can be a user, it can be a group, it can be a service principal, it can be a managed identity. So it can be any of this. And then let's go to the next one. So that's a security principal. Let's go have a look at the next point that we're talking about. So the next thing that we want to talk about, Sarkozy, is the role, right? So the role that we want to assign permissions to. Also, the role that's going to define the permission that we want to assign to a user. So what does the role look like, Sarkozy? The role is actually just a JSON document, right? So in the cloud, there's a lot of JSON documents in the cloud, right? So the role is just a JSON document. We saw yesterday that Azure policy is just a JSON document. But what does that look like? So for example, if you look within any of these roles, Sarkozy, you'll find 4 sections. So if people that are watching us, if they follow this very closely, so this will help you to understand. We have 4 sections. Number 1 section that you find under a role definition is a section called actions. So actions is where we define the management operations that the user can perform. So management operations is what we'll define here. What are the management operations that you can perform is what we specify under actions. That will make sense in a minute. Then we have data actions. Data action is where we specify what are the data plane operations that you can perform. So somebody may be thinking, Sir Kofi, what's the difference between these two, right? We have actions, we have data actions. What's the difference between these two? I'll give you an example, Sir Kofi. Let's take an example of an Azure storage account, right? So we have an Azure storage account. Now, this storage resource has data inside it. So I have data inside this storage account. If I want to give Sir Kofi permission to modify this storage account, the configuration, so you can change, maybe you can change the skill of the storage account. Maybe you can move it to a different location. You can do any of those management operations. All those are defined in the action section because those are management actions, right? Modify the configuration, enable HTTPS for the storage account. All those are management actions. If I want to give you permission to the data inside this storage account, I will need to specify a data action for you because that is talking about the data plane operation. So the fact that I give you management plane operation doesn't mean that you have access to data inside resources in Azure. So a quick example of that, Sakofi. Sorry, Sakofi, you wanted to say something?
No, just going to refer back to the data. So when you are given certain permission in terms of data, it will probably entails create, delete, update. Is it those kind of permission that you can get with the data?
Yes, but you can also do the same on the management plane, right? So I'll give you an example that can help to make it clearer. So it's like I give Sir Kofi the key to be able to enter a room, right? So I give you the key to the room, right? You can go into the room, you can move things around in the room. However, within the room, there's a locker, right? You do not have the key to open the locker, even though you have the key to the room itself.
I see.
Yeah, so that is what this is talking about. Because you have permission to manage a resource does not mean you have permission to the data inside that resource.
Right.
What gives you permission to manage a resource are operations that are defined over here in the action section. What gives you permission to the data inside the resource are operations that are defined under here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's sort of like how that works. So hopefully that makes sense to people. I think that we got a few more questions. Okay, so we'll just have some comments.
Yeah, up on the screen.
Yeah. So I can see it says, thanks for the amazing work. Thanks very much for that, DJ Charisma. And by the way, that's a cool name. I was wondering if you have an on-prem AD, how can you sync it to Azure AD Tenant and still retain the roles? No problems. So I still retain the roles. That's a very interesting question. So when you synchronize identity from on-prem AD to Azure AD, you use a tool called Azure AD Connect, right? So that's the tool that you use. At least there's another way to do that now, but the established way to do that is to install something called Azure AD Connect on premises, and then you synchronize your identity from on-premises to Azure AD. However, the roles of on-prem AD and Azure AD are separate. Just because somebody is a domain admin in Azure AD does not mean they are anything. In on-prem AD does not mean they have any role in Azure AD. However, what you can do, DJ Charisma, what you can do is, for example, on-prem AD, you could add users into a group in on-prem AD. So add them into a group in on-prem AD. Synchronize this group to Azure AD. Right? and then assign permission to that group to Azure AD roles or Azure Hardback roles. So that way, all you need to do is add a user to a group in on-prem AD, and then that group assignment gets synchronized to Azure AD, and then they get the permission of the group. So that'll probably be the easiest way to achieve that. Okay, so let's move on here. So Sarkozy, does that make sense now in terms of the difference between
data?
Yeah.
Sense, yeah.
So let me show you like an interesting one of that. So the first thing I'll do is, because this can be confusing to people. So what I'll do is I'll go make Sarkozy an owner of my subscription now. So now you're a global administrator, and I'm going to go make you an owner of my subscription. So because right now, let's go over here. Again, this is logged in as Sarkozy. I refresh the screen. I can't see any subscription. It's like there's no subscription that's ready. That's because Sarkozy does not currently have any permission to Azure resources. So what I'll do is I'll go over here. I'll go to my Azure subscription, and I'll go to assign a role to Sarkozy on my subscription. So if I go to access control IAM, so that's how we apply Azure resource roles. So I can go to add role assignment here, or I can go to add, then role assignment. So they're the same thing. So what I'll do is I'll assign the owner role to you. So owner role, and I'll look for Sarkozy's account, and I'll click on save. We'll get to what the owner role is in a minute. But essentially, owner role just means it's like the equivalent of global admin for Azure resources. You can do anything and everything. Yeah. So that's what that is. So now if I go under role assignments, I can see that Sarkozy now is an owner of this subscription. So I can see that. So what I can do is if I go back to this, if I refresh this, hopefully the subscription now shows up. There we go. Can you see that? It's like magic. And it's saying Sarkozy is now an owner. So that's what I mean. So Sarkozy being an owner means you can do everything. But I want to show you some very interesting things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go create a storage account very quickly, because I want to show you this difference. So let's go to create a storage account.
So now that I'm an owner, essentially I should be able to create, delete, or do anything without any limitation.
Exactly. You can do anything without any limitation. So, and here I am with Sarkozy. I'm just creating a storage account called UK Storage 001. I'll make that locally redundant storage. Oh, I believe that I have an Azure policy from yesterday. So that's where I need to go get rid of that policy, because that policy is what I used to lock things down, if you remember from yesterday.
Yeah, I remember. Prevent you from creating a resource.
Yeah.
Storage resource.
So that's going to stop me. Here we go. So let's go get rid of that first of all. So delete that, get rid of that completely. So that's good. So now we should be able to go create this storage account. So I just want to show you that significance of that data action versus data action. So because what I want to show you is that even as a subscription, okay, Azure policy is still kicking in, is my guess. Yeah, that's Azure policy still kicking in. So it's going to go away eventually. I'll just redeploy it. So what I want to show you, Sarkozy, is that even with owner permissions, it does not mean that you have permission to access anything it does not mean that you have permission to access any data within an Azure storage account just because you're the owner of the subscription. So that's what I want to quickly show you. So I believe they should go through now. So, and once that goes through, I'll have my storage account. Then I'll go to upload an object into it, and then we're going to see how that works. So while this is going on, let's get back to this. So there are two other fields with Azure RoleBased Access Control definition. There is also the not actions, and there is the not data action. So what does this mean by not actions and not data action? See, Azure RoleBased Access Control has no way to specify a deny permission. So we can't specify a deny permission. Microsoft has a feature where we can configure something called a deny assignment. However, that is not something that that's something that we have to do from the Azure Blueprint level, right? So that's not something that we do on the level that we're currently conversing. But we'll touch on that when we talk about Blueprint later. So, but Azure Role-Based Access Control does not have a way to do deny assignment. It doesn't do that. So what does not actions mean? So not action is a way that we can exclude certain permissions for a user. Right? If you're thinking to your mind, what does that mean? Let me go show you an example of what that means here. Let's go to the next slide. So what you're looking at here, ladies and gentlemen, is what the contributor role looks like behind the scenes. So you can see that there are 4 sections that we talked about. There's the actions, not actions, data actions, not data actions, right? Those 4 options. Now, if you look under the action settings, you can see that the contributor role has permission to do everything. That's what the star means. It means this contributor role can do everything. However, the contributor role is now saying under not actions, they are excluding 3 things that they are saying you cannot do from this everything. So that's what not actions mean. So by default, what an owner permission can do is an owner permission can add permission to anybody, and an owner permission can can modify the permissions of any resource, right? In the Azure subscription. The contributor role can do everything but cannot add permission to other people. Right. So, and this is the reason why it cannot add permission to other people, because the option to add permission has been excluded for that role. That's the reason why.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so that's how it works. So essentially they're saying, yeah, you can do everything. However, I'm not going to allow you to modify authorization, which is how you add permission to people. So that's how that works. However, you'll notice that for data action, it's empty. So that means it has no permission to do anything on the data plane. Okay, let's go test this out so that it makes sense to us. So I have my storage account. I'm going to go on the my storage account very quickly. I'm going to go on the blob service. Where are you, blob service? Here we go. So go on the containers. I'm just going to create a container here. So I'll call it container 1. And container 1, I'm going to upload some objects into it. So just basic object upload. So I'll just grab a file like that. So let's grab that file. Let's upload that file. So here I am, Sarkofi, have uploaded the file to the storage account. Now, remember that you have owner permission, right, on this subscription. So what I'll do is I'll change the authentication method to use your Azure AD account that has owner permission. Let's see whether you can still access data in the storage account. If I go ahead and use Sarkofi's Azure AD, it says you don't have permission. But hold on, I thought you are the owner. I thought you can do everything. How come you cannot access data in a storage account even though you're the owner? Let's go investigate Sarkofi and let's see the reason why that is. So what I'll do is I'll go under subscription and I'll go under that subscription and let's go investigate the permission that the owner role has. So I'll go to roles preview. I'll look for the owner role, which it should show up in a few seconds, hopefully. So we have the owner role there, right? And it says grant full access to manager resources, right? Including permission to assign access to people. So what I'm just going to do, Sarkofi, is I'm going to go to, let's do that. Let's go to that owner role. Let's clone it. And I'll make it larger a bit. So, and let's go to under the JSON. So if you have a look, let's look at the permission of the owner role. Under actions, Sarkofi, can you see what it has? It has the star.
Yeah.
And what does the star means? It means can do anything.
Yeah.
Under not actions, nothing is excluded. However, under data action, it has no permission. That's the reason why even as the owner, you cannot access data in a storage account with your Azure AD account because you do not have any permission over here. That's the reason.
All right. So in that case, is it possible to give the owner access to that data as well if you choose to?
So if you want to do that, you do exactly what I'm doing here, which is where you go to clone the role. So you clone the role, you make your modification, and essentially I can say maybe owner with data access role, right? I'm cloning it from the owner role, and then I can go to under here, and then maybe under data actions, maybe I had a edit that, and I can add a star, right? And then if I do that, essentially now it has permission to do, all action, and also should be able to do all data action. So that is what we can do. We can do that.
Right. That's quite straightforward and easy.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's sort of like how that works. So let's move on very quickly. So that hopefully that makes sense to people, those four areas. So here are the four common roles that you see. You see the owner role, you see the contributor role, you see the reader role, you see user access administrator. We'll just talk about a few of them. So owner has full access to everything, including the ability to add permissions for other people. We mentioned contributor has permission to manage everything, however, cannot grant access to other people. Reader just mean can read everything, however, cannot modify anything. So those are the options.
So in regards to the contributor, can we have a contributor for specific services or resources? So for example, can we have a network contributor?
Very good questions, Akofi. So the answer to that is yes, we can do that. Actually, there are built-in roles that Microsoft has already that essentially focuses on individual resources. So if I go under access control here, if I'm assigning a role to a user, I can sort of make that definition, and I can say that here. So for example, under the add role assignment, you see that there are multiple built-in roles, including resource-specific roles. So if I scroll down, you can see AG Food Platform Service Contributor, API Manage, Application Group Contributor. So just individual resource contributor levels. So yes, is that the answer to that question?
That's impressive. So nice and easy. You can just get the definition already and then apply it.
Yes, exactly. So let's take this further and then we'll bring it to conclusion. So scope. So scope is where we define the level that the person is going to have the access. And we can define access at any of the scope. We can define access at the vote management group. And we talked about that yesterday, Sakofi and myself. We can define access at the child management group, at the subscription level, at the resource group level, and even at the resource level. So I can actually go to a single resource and say, this user only has this permission to only this resource. So we can do that. Right. So once we have all of this together, here's what our role assignment looks like. So our role assignment, we have a service principal, which is the identity that we want to assign permissions to. In this case, we want to assign permission to a group called marketing group. We have a role definition, which is the permission that we want to grant to the identity. In this case, we are granting the contributor role definition. And we have the scope, which is the level that we want to grant the user access. In this case, we're granting the user, the marketing group, we're granting them contributor role at the sales resource group level. So that's how we define our role assignment. So here's a quick question. What happens if I assign, let's say, contributor role to Sakofi on the subscription level, and I assign reader role to Sakofi on the resource group level? What happens? What do you think is going to happen, Sakofi?
I think in terms of the resource level, that means I can only get access to as a reader. Because in terms of the hierarchy of the whole chain, the lower one and lower level will take priority over the higher level. Is that correct?
So you're close, but what it's actually going to do is that it's going to combine everything together.
Okay, combine.
Yeah. So because what's the name? Because role-based access control again in Azure, we can't do deny, right? Yeah. There's no way to do deny. So we can only exclude. We cannot do deny. So it's not as if we can deny something at this level or deny something. So we cannot do deny with role-based access control. So again, there's something called a deny assignment that Sakofi and myself will cover later. But in this case, the user will have contributor at the subscription level, and at the resource group level, contributor plus reader, which is essentially the same thing as contributor. Yeah, so that's what's going to happen at the lower level. So I can see that there's another question.
Okay, we've got a question here. Let me just bring it up.
So will the AD Connect syncing affect the GPO in Active Directory on premises? So the answer to that, Okoyemi, is no. So because on the first day when we looked at Azure AD, one of the things that Sakofi and myself mentioned is that Azure AD does not have any reference to GPO, right? So we mentioned Azure AD doesn't do organization units, it doesn't do GPO. So when you're synchronizing your identities from on-premises to Azure AD only takes users and groups, and that's what it deals with.
And then they'll apply the policies we have on Azure AD, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. And then we'll assign the role to Azure AD to the Azure resources. Okay. So what we'll do here is I believe that probably brings us to the end of this. So we have a very, very quick day today, Sakofi. So that brings us to the end of Azure role-based access control. So hopefully that makes sense to people. We have the two different roles. Again, let's bring the summary back. Let's go to the summary. So the summary of what we discussed here is we have Azure AD roles that we can use to grant permission to Azure AD resources or identities. We have Azure role-based access control roles that we can use to grant permission to Azure resources. Example of Azure AD roles are global administrator and user administrator. Example of Azure role-based access control roles are owner, contributor, and reader. Then we mentioned that if you break down the roles and you look at what's actually within it, the role definition has a section for action, which is where we configure management level operations and permissions. It has a section for data action, which is where we configure data plane operations that the role can perform. We have not actions, which is where we can exclude management permissions that we want to exclude from what the role can perform. And we have not data action, which we can use to exclude we can use to exclude data plane operations and that we don't want the role to be able to perform. So that's sort of like the summary of everything that we talked about today. So hopefully that was useful.
Yeah, we do have a few questions. So let me bring that up on the screen.
Yes, sir.
All right, so this one is about the exams. You want to know about how the exams are actually set, and one because it's more like they'll give you scenario-based questions, right?
Yeah. Yes. So how are the exams set? So I don't have full information about how the exams are set. However, there's a few information I can share with you on that. So they try to stick with concept-based questions. So rather than trying to, do things that can change because things change very quickly in Azure, they try to stick with concept-based questions. Like what Sakovi said is going to be a combination of different types of questions. Majority of them will be multiple choice, but you also have about 2 scenario-based questions. So scenario-based question is where you're going to get a full story. There's an organization. They have a company in Nigeria. They have a company in South Africa. They have a company in Canada. They have 50 engineers over here. They'll tell you a full story. And then they'll ask you about 4 or 5 questions based on that scenario. So you get about 2 or 3 of those types of question. But majority of the other question will be multiple choice question, drag and drop questions. So there used to be hands-on activity. However, what Microsoft are doing is because of the pandemic, Microsoft are leading with compassion. So what they're doing is they are temporarily suspending those sort of questions. So they temporarily suspend that. So that's sort of like the way that works. But the exam questions, preparing for the exam, again, follow through with the series that we're going through that will help your understanding. So we focus mainly a lot on understanding in line with the exam objectives, but it's a lot of understanding. What we're talking about is what we focus on. And also read a lot of FAQ documents on the Microsoft website. So that will help also. So, and we'll share some other tips on the exam. So one of the things that we'll do is on the final day of this live study series for Azure Administrator, we have a series called Exam Prep. And in this Exam Prep series, we'll be asking questions. So Sakofi will be asking me questions. I'll be asking Sakofi questions. And we'll be asking you questions. And essentially, we'll be going through like just some test questions with each other and see, how we do.
Okay. We have another question. Let me bring it up.
So yes, it does. Can I have custom properties for users? Azure AD, e.g., floor number. Very, 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 very good question, Dara. Very, very good question. Um, to an extent, yes. So there are certain fields that are left open that we can set. Right. So there are certain custom attributes that we can set. Actually, when you're synchronizing your identities from on premises, you can include custom attributes and you can synchronize some custom attribute from on premises to Azure AD. So it does allow us to be able to do that to an extent. So unfortunately, I can't show that over here, but to an extent, yes, we can have certain custom attribute and custom properties for Azure AD users.
Okay, that's great. So I think this is the end of the our session for today. And like we said at the beginning of this session and also yesterday, we do have a lab that you can actually practice what we discussed yesterday and also today. So that means the role-based access control and also the other one, which is the remind me, Sir David, the governance that we did that yesterday.
Yeah, Azure policy.
The policies, yeah, and the policies as well. So if Sir David can actually bring up.
Yep, let's bring that up.
Yep. So these are the objectives for the labs. So essentially, this first one is about creating the managed group. You remember that Sir David created these roots group and also those child groups as well. So this one will more likely are trying to mimic exactly what Sir David actually did during the training as well. So the next task will be the creation of the rollback role, which we did today. So yeah, so this is what we have for you guys. I hope you guys take part in these sort of labs, and quite helpful because it will actually drive the message home, and practice also make perfect. So do not miss out on this one.
Yeah, and to mention, so these are labs that are actually available for free on GitHub. So these are labs that are part of like the Microsoft Learn lab materials available for anyone to do for free on GitHub. But essentially, what we are doing is we've recorded ourselves doing those labs. So what we're going to do is in the description of this video at the end, we're going to add the link to the free Microsoft created lab on GitHub. We're going to add the link to that. And we'll also add the link to the recorded video that Sakofi and myself put together showing ourselves doing this task. So that will gives you hands-on practice. And then there is another lab, right, Sakofi? We have a second lab.
Yeah, let me just bring this up. All right, so the second lab. Right, so the second lab is about creating, using the Azure policy to create a tag to actually, perform exactly what Sir David did. I think yesterday Sir David showed us using denying access to resource, but this one will actually append a tag to a specific resource when it's missing. So just go through with that one as well.
Yep, exactly. So it's exactly what Sakofi described, which is you're going to create an Azure policy that's going to enforce tagging, and if a user tries to deploy a resource that violates that policy, it's going to be denied. However, you're going to now use another policy to automatically apply a tag if a user tries to deploy that. So what it's going to do is it's going to apply the tag and then it's going to deploy the storage account. So again, both labs have been combined together in a single video, and then you will get the links to both of them in the instruction in the description below, and then you get the links to the video also, and then you can just use that for your hands-on practice. And let us know how you get on with that. So it's good to just get used to things.
Okay, so I just posted the link to the lab in the chat as well. So for convenience sake, you can just grab it from there as well if you want to.
Yeah. Okay. Sakofi, anything? So what's going on tonight? What's you going to be doing for the rest of the day? Having a sleep, resting, sleeping, going out?
It's just I'm just going to stay home, not doing much after the session. It's getting to the middle of the week and there's a lot of things I need to catch up at home. So not doing much. I mean, are you doing much yourself after this session?
So
Or?
you know how it goes, like coffee, it never stops. So right
Yeah.
after I finish this, right, I've got like the AWS. Remember, I booked like the AWS DevOps exam.
Yeah.
So I've got we put too much pressure on ourselves. I've got to go prepare for that. It's gonna be That's sort of like how we do. Like it's just like our industry
Yeah.
never stops, right? It's like we're just constantly going in the industry.
Yeah.
We'll see how far we can keep up, Sakofi. We'll see. Okay, everyone. Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.
For joining us.
All right. See you guys later.
See you tomorrow. It's not tomorrow. See you next week.
Next
Bye.
week. Next week, Monday.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.